Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling over delightful pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Now, this week is Budget Week in the United Kingdom, and pretty much every political, even most history podcasts that come out this week are going to be talking about the budget, but this is pretty much a budget-free zone. We thought we'd focus on other things for our midweek matters of interest, although on this Sunday, we will be talking about one of the most important and consequential budgets in British history, the Conservative budget delivered by Geoffrey Howe in 1981. Tune in from Sunday evening to listen to that. But for now, let's get back to matters of interest. Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, my matter of interest was spurred by an article in the New Statesman this past week about the leadership of Keir Starmer. And of course, there's been endless speculation about Keir Starmer's future, and I'm sure that will continue until one day Keir Starmer is no longer leader of the Labour Party. The bit that caught my interest, though, was in Kevin Maguire's Commons Confidential piece, where he talks about the Westminster gossip mill. And he wrote, quote, "One new whisper is that a senior whip is considering resigning so they can act as a stalking horse, trying to gather the required 81 nominations to officially trigger a leadership challenge for stronger candidates." Now, this indeed is a new whisper, not one that I'd heard before, but it's quite an intriguing one. I think it's just worth talking about it to our audience and how that might work. So the rules of the Labour Party with regard to challenging a leader are as follows. It says, where there is no vacancy, nominations may be sought by potential challengers. In this case, any nomination must be supported by 20% of the Commons members of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Nominations not attaining this threshold shall be null and void. The sitting leader or deputy leader shall not be required to seek nominations in the event of a challenge under this rule. So that's how you challenge a Labour leader. That's how you spark off a Labour leadership election challenge. Now, people listening to this may think, well, that's actually kind of vague. How do you actually start the contest? In previous iterations of the rulebook, it used to specify a particular time period. Way back when, it used to be something you could only do at the time of the annual party conference, which was itself an echo of the times when members had no role in the election of the leader, and it was the annual general meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. So it used to be that if you wanted to do a challenge, there was one time a year that you could do it, but it was open, pretty wide open to do every year. Now, the rules open the possibility that you could have a leadership challenge at any time, as long as you gather these signatures of 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party, of the Labour MPs. But I think there is some question as to, do you need those names first? Can anyone declare? Can any disgruntled backbench MP announce that they want to challenge the leader? Is this something that Keir Starmer could face every month of his leadership if he wanted to? There's a lot of ambiguity here. And so this stalking horse concept is one potential way that you could kick off the process.
It's interesting. So quite clearly, the Labour Party's been on a similar journey to the Conservative Party historically about challenging the leader, in that it used to be the case in the Tory Party, well, way back when you couldn't challenge a leader formally at all. But then it became the case that there was an annual window in which a challenge could be launched, again, exclusively within the Parliamentary Party. And then that transitioned to having a threshold. It used to be 15% in the Conservative Party. Now it's a third of MPs, which would trigger a contest. So in spite of what has been the, I think, pretty evident chaos of Conservative leadership rules in recent decades, the Labour Party seems to have got itself into a pretty similar position to where the Conservatives have been since 1998 or so. What's really interesting about this report is that it uses the term stalking horse. That's a term that's been bandied around pretty freely over the years, certainly on the Conservative side, about leadership elections. It actually goes back to hunting and the idea that you would disguise yourself as a horse or maybe even behind a horse when you're trying to line up the prey that you're targeting. But it eventually became used as a term for somebody who would put their head above the parapet, effectively launch a leadership challenge, but with somebody behind them who was the more serious candidate. So nobody ever expected a stalking horse to win a leadership contest, but they might stand, for example, Sir Anthony Mayor in 1989, to try and gauge the mood for change within the parliamentary party, to try and see how many MPs actually wanted to see a new leader take on the role, and then their hope would be that there would be a sufficient rebellion to either get them out of the contest, get the sitting leader out of the contest, and in that case, there would be a second round in which new candidates could enter. And that might mean that the person who was hiding behind the stalking horse could then come forward, or it might lay the groundwork for a more substantive leadership challenge the following year. This, of course, seems to be a different approach, really, to using the term stalking horse, but a similar idea that somebody, in this case, a senior whip, would basically be the one to lead the charge, but not for themselves, to try and bring about a new leader. I wonder, Richard, in your view, is what's happening here is that somebody would get the names. I think it's 81 names that have been talked about now rather than 80, because some Labour MPs who had lost the whip have been given the whip back. But that somebody would basically get the names on a piece of paper, use that to trigger a leadership challenge, but then withdraw their own nomination and allow those names to go nominate somebody else. Is that the sort of way in which the term stalking horse is now being used in Labour?
Yes, I think it is. Although, just going back to what you said before, isn't it the case now that there is no need for a stalking horse under the Conservative rules because of the vote of no confidence procedure? And that is a profound difference from the Labour Party that I think people, until maybe recently, hadn't quite understood. I mean, under the Tory rules, you gather these letters and you don't need to have a candidate to challenge the leader. The leader faces an up or down vote, and that seals the leader's fate. If the leader loses the vote of no confidence, the leader is not allowed under the Conservative rules to go back to the membership. There's no possibility under the Conservative rules of a leader refreshing their mandate in front of the membership once they become leader. Whereas in Labour, there is no vote of no confidence mechanism. There is just this 20% of MPs hurdle. And then once that happens, then the leader and whoever's challenged them has to duke it out in front of the Labour members. It seems to me now that Labour's rules are much more hospitable to the concept of a stalking horse, whereas the Conservative rules have basically ruled it out.
Yes, absolutely. Just on the Tory party, you're entirely right. The Conservative stalking horse was put to sleep in 1998 with the new leadership rules, which, like you say, meant that it would be an up or down vote on the incumbent leader. And if they lost that, they couldn't stand to be their own successor. So there was no need for a rival. It's a post 1965, pre 1998 arrangement in the Conservative Party. That's when they had a particular set of rules which enabled stalking horses to play a role. So it was killed basically in the late 90s, the Tory version of the stalking horse, but has been regenerated as a socialist alternative.
Yes, and so just to talk through the socialist alternative for a moment. So there are currently 405 MPs who carry the Labour whip. This number has fluctuated quite dramatically since the general election. There were 411 Labour MPs elected in July of 2024. Then a number of them lost the whip because they had violated Keir Starmer's policy wishes in a variety of ways. Some had also said or done things they shouldn't have done. There was a by-election in one case in Cheshire where Labour lost the seat to Reform, and two voluntarily left the party, Zara Sultana and Rosie Duffield. So at the moment, there are 405. This means that 20% of the PLP is exactly 81. So you need to find 81 Labour MPs. If you can find 81 Labour MPs, then, well, that's it, really. Then you can force Keir Starmer to fight for his job in front of the Labour membership. And quite frankly, I would imagine that under almost any pairing, except perhaps Starmer versus Reeves, or yeah, I mean, difficult to find someone that Keir Starmer is more popular than at the moment. He's one of the least popular members of his own cabinet. Keir Starmer, I think, would lose. So Keir Starmer is in a very vulnerable position if a Labour MP is willing and able to coordinate and find those 81 MPs. And so the suggestion here is that, part of the problem of getting to that point is that no MP wants to necessarily be the one to stick their neck out and to declare their intention to go against Starmer and then fail to meet the threshold, not least because if they're a member of the front bench, let's say, they would probably have to resign their front bench position, or if they didn't resign, Keir Starmer would quite likely boot them out within a short matter of time. The person I've heard mentioned as potentially tied to this, but it's just rumor, so it's not grounded in a great deal, is that this unnamed senior whip is potentially the chief whip, Jonathan Reynolds. And Reynolds is someone who does have a lot of respect and popularity among his colleagues in the Parliamentary Labour Party. And he is the sort of person that if he decided to declare against Starmer, that would be a very serious threat to Starmer. And the idea, yes, would be that maybe he doesn't even need to collect the 81, the total 81 number, but he just gets the process underway. And then that opens up space for other potential challengers to move in and start collecting nominations.
Interestingly, there was some polling this week that was done by Survation and Labour List. And from what I can see, it's not polling of Labour members, so its utility isn't necessarily obvious. But they looked at who would win against Starmer in head-to-head contests. And they found that Streeting, Rayner, Andy Burnham and Ed Miliband would all win. Interestingly, in this particular example of polling, well, like I say, it seems to have been the general public, not Labour members. They did have Starmer beating Phillipson, Powell and Shabana Mahmood, which I find perhaps surprising, given that Keir Starmer now appears very unpopular with his own party, with its membership, and certainly that Lucy Powell has just won the deputy leadership election against somebody who was the Starmerite candidate, or certainly seen as the Starmerite candidate in Bridget Phillipson. So it'll be interesting to see how that does play out, if indeed these events do come to unfold. My general feeling would be, and there's a couple of interesting points around here that I think we should reflect on. One is that earlier on this month, in a dramatic headline-grabbing move, Number 10 briefed, seemingly without provocation, that if there was a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer, then he would fight it. Now, that's a way of basically saying that he would not go down without a scrap, that he would take it to the membership, and therefore that somebody who wanted to challenge him would have to be willing to resign from the cabinet, resign from the government, and basically stake their pitch from the backbenchers, in effect. That's how I read that anyway. And that would also be a way of signalling that if you want to get these 81 names, which it seems that you do need to get, then you would struggle to get that from the payroll vote, from people who are part of the government, unless they were willing to resign as well in order to do that. So how likely do you think it is that somebody could get the 81 names, whether as a stalking horse or otherwise?
Well, just on the payroll vote, we have obviously an example of a recent leadership election, or should I say deputy leadership election, where MPs did nominate candidates. And in that instance, while many members of the front bench did not nominate a candidate, there were quite a few members of the front bench, including members of the cabinet, who did nominate candidates in the deputy leadership contest. So people like Pat McFadden and Emma Reynolds and Douglas Alexander and Seema Malhotra, these are all members of the cabinet or undersecretaries of state, nominated people. I think in all of those cases, they nominated Bridget Phillipson. Now, obviously, it's different nominating a candidate for deputy leader versus nominating a candidate for leader, given that the leader is also in charge of the personnel decisions about who sits in these different ministerial roles. But it is noteworthy that in the deputy leadership contest, members of the front bench didn't take a collective view as to not participate in that and leave that decision to the backbenchers. On to your question about how difficult or easy it is to get to the 81. I mean, we can look at the deputy leadership contest to provide some insight there. I mean, ultimately, it was a contest between Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, and Lucy Powell, who had been sacked as Leader of the House of Commons a few months beforehand and was a backbencher at the time that she won the nomination. There were other candidates who announced their intentions to stand. Emily Thornberry, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Belle Ribeiro Addy, member of the Socialist Campaign Group, Paula Barker, another left-wing MP from Liverpool. I have a sort of soft spot for her. And I think for a time, Alison McGovern, the right-wing junior minister, who didn't seem to get anywhere. I think it's important also to say that these nominations are not secret, which I think is different than the Conservative stalking horse system as it was, where people could nominate in secret. So the Labour Party publish the names of the nominees on the Labour Party website. And so you can go back and actually, I went back and looked at the final list of the nominators. And so in the end, only 3 candidates actually received formal nominations at the end. So people like Emily Thornberry and Paula Barker and Alison McGovern, they withdrew, and their nominees were entitled to nominate other candidates. In fact, in the case of, say, Paula Barker, she herself then ended up nominating Lucy Powell. So that, I think, is what the stalking horse would ideally do, is they could gather up nominations, other candidates would announce their intention to stand, the stalking horse would withdraw, and then reopen the possibility of the people who had nominated the stalking horse going to other candidates. It's quite curious in the deputy leadership contest that there were only 2 candidates nominated at the end. Lucy Powell got 117 nominations, Bridget Phillipson got 175, Belle Ribeiro Addy got 24, but that only tops up to 316 MPs. And at that time, there were even more Labour MPs who didn't have the whip. So there were a total of 399 MPs who had the Labour whip back in September, which meant 83 Labour MPs didn't make any nomination at all. And at that time, the magic number was 80. So first of all, they could have given the nomination to Belle Ribeiro Addy if she had received a further 56, I think. Or those 83 could have coordinated around a completely different candidate, and they could have selected another candidate, and they chose not to. And obviously, some chose not to because they were very senior figures, like obviously the Prime Minister. Well, I say obviously, but the Prime Minister did not nominate anyone, for example. Various members of cabinet didn't nominate people. Emily Thornberry didn't nominate anyone in the end. I wonder if she just felt a bit bitter about the whole process.
I should say, presumably in the case of Keir Starmer not nominating anybody, that's in part because on the theme of his unpopularity, it would be seen as a kiss of death. Already Phillipson was hampered, I would probably argue, by the fact she was seen as Starmer's candidate. She was the cabinet candidate in this election already. So I assume if he had nominated her as well, that probably wouldn't have helped her case.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. So what I'm saying here is that under that contest, it was perfectly mathematically possible to have 3 candidates. And if there had been a third candidate who was more popular than Belle Ribeiro Addy, then you could have had a 3-way contest. Under the scenario of a challenge, as I mentioned earlier on, the rules explicitly state that the leader does not need the nominations of MPs. They're automatically on the ballot should they wish to fight for their leadership among the membership. So under that possibility, mathematically, you could get to 4 candidates, or even more. But I think it's probably the case that if Starmer sought to fight for the leadership, he would try to get MPs to nominate him symbolically. This is what Neil Kinnock did in 1988 when Tony Benn challenged him. He didn't need to get nominations, but he got them anyway to build up this sense of support for him. I think Starmer would do that also to try to diminish the field and whittle away potential candidates. So I think it's possible, though. I mean, he's very unpopular. The party is very unpopular. He personally is very unpopular. A lot of Labour MPs are looking at the precipice of losing their seats at the moment. And I do think if you had someone who fired the starting gun and a couple of senior figures put their names forward, you could find one or two who I think certainly would get the 81 nominations.
As you've been talking then, I think I've come to the conclusion that this is not going to be the way in which Keir Starmer's premiership and the leadership of the Labour Party ends. I'll tell you why. First of all, because I think the comparison with the deputy leadership election is interesting. But because we're assuming that Keir Starmer would be in post at the time, I think we have to assume that the vast majority of the payroll vote stays with him. And there's a very significant payroll vote in government. Once you do cabinets, ministers, PPSs, there's a lot of people who are tied into loyalty to the Prime Minister and therefore the leader. So I think we have to assume that unless there was a mass set of resignations, which in and of itself would probably trigger him to leave the Premiership and leave the leadership, a bit like it did with Boris Johnson in 2022, there's not going to be people nominating an alternative leader from within the ministerial ranks. We also add into that, I think, that there are lots of ambitious backbench MPs who don't necessarily want to be the people who are putting their head above the parapet to take on an existing leader. The fact that the people who nominate an alternative are public, I think, is a really important part of this. That if you are sat on the backbenches, you're a 2024 MP, perhaps one of the ones with a slightly better majority who thinks that they could still be around after the next general election. Do you want to be seen as somebody who is a troublemaker against the leader? If it seems the case that the herd has moved, as Johnson said in 2022, and that there is a big move in one direction towards somebody, then you probably want to get on that bandwagon early. But if it doesn't seem clear that that's happening, if it's all a bit messier, if it's all a bit murkier, then my feeling would be that ambitious backbench, new intake Labour MPs would want to keep their powder dry and not want to be seen as being part of a mutiny, effectively. So I don't necessarily see this happening unless there was somebody much more senior who was willing to go over the top, probably more senior even than Jonathan Reynolds, unless there was somebody like Wes Streeting or Shabana Mahmood who were willing to resign from the cabinet and say, look, I'm standing for the leadership and I'm asking people to join me outside of government from the backbenchers to get me these 81 names that I need to launch a challenge. Now, Streeting has ruled out him doing that, so far as I'm aware, in interviews. But in that case, I think the dam could burst. But I think that would be required. And the final point I just wanted to say on this is the lesson of the Conservative leadership in recent years has been that the rumours of discontent tend to run way ahead of the reality of discontent, certainly in terms of putting pen to paper in the way that would be required. So if we think back to 2018, there were rumours months in advance of the confidence vote in Theresa May that there was going to be a confidence vote in her. People like Jacob Rees-Mogg went public and said, I put a letter in, I'm calling on colleagues to put a letter in as well. And still the threshold, which was only 15% at the time, and those people could remain anonymous. Rees-Mogg outed himself, but most people chose to remain anonymous who wrote letters in against Theresa May. It still took weeks for that vote to actually happen. Same was true actually with Boris Johnson, somewhat confused in that case by the fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened and some people began withdrawing their letters because they thought that was the wrong time. But certainly there was discontent and there was grumblings about Johnson's leadership long before the Platinum Jubilee weekend and then the vote that took place on his leadership in the confidence vote. Like I say, and that was anonymous letters and that was with a lower threshold. So my feeling is, that this isn't going to be the way in which they remove Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and leader. And what it will take is something much more symbolic to really punch a hole in the dam, and then for lots of other people to follow an alternative leader at that time.
Well, I'm not so sure, to be honest, because I think part of the problem for those who want to remove Starmer at the moment is the challenge of being the first to move, and also a worry that others could end up doing better than them. So for example, I think one of the hesitancies that a Wes Streeting might have is that if he declares a challenge against Starmer, then you'll have other people to the left of him also declare a challenge against Starmer, and then when it comes to the membership, they'll vote for the more left-wing candidate. And I think if you had someone like the chief whip um, blow open the process to begin with, then in a sense, a Streeting would have no choice but to declare their candidacy, um, and would have to jump in as others were jumping in as well. The other way that this could pan out, and I think that this has also been reported on, and we should pay attention to this, is that a group of left-wing MPs are trying to put together a critical mass of 80 to 100 of them who would agree to pledge their support to a particular candidate that they would select or pre-select internally. They're calling themselves the Tribune Group, which is an homage to the sort of group of left-wing MPs that back in the 1940s was associated with the left-wing newspaper Tribune and has emerged at various times throughout Labour history. And as I understand it, the ringleaders around that are people like Louise Haigh, who was the Transport Secretary, who was sacked by Keir Starmer for earlier indiscretions before she was an MP, and Angela Rayner, of course, the former deputy leader. And I do think that if they got their act together and they said, all right, we're going to vote or decide internally that we're going to back Angela Rayner, and all of us are going to move at once, and all 80 of us, or whatever, 80 plus of us, are going to put our names to a nomination paper for Angela Rayner once Angela declares that she's going to challenge Starmer. I think Starmer's sunk, to be honest. I think that's all it takes. I really think it is just a matter of 80, 81 MPs getting their act together around one person, sorting that out themselves behind the scenes, and then moving. And then I think he's done for. I think you could be rightly in the sense that it's difficult to see him then fighting a candidacy among the membership, because probably at that point then there would be members of the cabinet who might move to nominate Rayner and might resign, and the government might have a sense of collapse. And in that scenario, you could imagine Starmer saying, for the sake of holding the government alive, keeping the government alive, I'm not going to be a candidate. I'm going to stay on as Prime Minister until a Labour leader is elected, and we're going to have an open contest to select my successor. But even if he decided to go for it and say, as I'm going to be a sitting Prime Minister and spend the next 2 months talking to Labour constituency, Labour parties, and trying to get Labour members to vote for me for leader, and then I'm going to lose that humiliation in a kind of humiliation. If he's prepared to put himself through that, I think he'd lose. It's a lose-lose for him, basically.
There's much more we could say on this, including, and you've just piqued the idea in my mind then, the idea that if it's a challenger from within the cabinet versus a challenger from outside of the cabinet, that actually does arguably change what his thinking process will be around what he does. So there's a huge amount of complexity and so many different variables that go into bringing down a leader and trying to second guess what may happen afterwards. I'm sure it's an issue that we'll return to again soon. For my matter of interest this week, I wanted to talk about the extraordinary volatility that we're seeing in local government by-elections. So volatility is really one of the great buzzwords about British politics in 2025. We're seeing huge amounts of it, whether it's Reform leading the polls, in fact actually becoming quite stable in their lead of the polls, although there's some signs that they're declining more recently, whether it's the Green Party surging under the leadership of Zach Polanski. And so I thought the local government by-elections give us the chance to do two things. One, they give us a chance to zoom out a little bit and look at what are the bigger trends that are going on in English politics in particular. Most of them have been in England, and I think it's in England where we can see a little bit more of the dynamics that are going to play out in the next general election. But they also give us a chance to really zoom in on some really particular electoral outcomes in relatively small wards or divisions in the country. The big picture, if we think about local government by-elections since the 2025 local elections, and there have been 170 by-elections since the 1st of May 2025, the big picture is great for Reform. It's decent for the Lib Dems. It's pretty grim for the Tories, I won't lie. And it's appalling for Labour. Now, that is the headline news, basically. So Reform have defended 8 seats in by-elections, and they've won 57 seats. The Lib Dems have defended 31, and they've won 49. The Conservatives have defended 38, and they've won just 18. And Labour have defended 53, and they've won just 14. So that's the big picture. Interestingly, as it happens, the Green Party, although Zach Polanski's leadership is relatively young, have not really been making a mark since the 1st of May in local government by-elections. They've defended 12 seats and they've gone on to win 14. So really very little change in terms of what the Greens are winning. But I looked at the individual results for the local government by-elections that took place just last week, and there really is something in there for everyone. If we start with what's there for the Conservative Party, there was a by-election in Hale, in Trafford, part of Greater Manchester, in which the Conservatives gained a seat from the Greens, and their Conservative vote share went up by 9.7% to 46.5%. Remarkable when you look at the national polling, that there's a part of the country, particularly a part of the country that's been moving away from the Conservatives in recent years, where they won almost half of the vote. If you're the Labour Party and you want some cause for cheer, there was a by-election in South Bank in Redcar and Cleveland, where the Labour vote was down by 17.8%, but still they won 47.4% of the vote, and Reform failed to take that seat off them. Redcar surely being the sort of place in the former Red Wall that went Conservatives that the Reform Party will want to be winning next time if they're really to have a chance, as they all seem to think, of forming a majority government. For the Lib Dems, there was good news in Quinton, which is in Stratford-upon-Avon, where their vote share went up by 3.5% to 47.3%. Now, that's a seat that they won and won well in 2023, which was a time when the Conservative Party was doing very poorly, and where there were some questions really about whether or not Lib Dem performance at that time was just an anti-Tory vote that was being loaned to the Liberal Democrats, or whether it was something that could be sustained even when the Conservatives went into opposition. If you're a Lib Dem who wants to take it as a bit of positive news, that by-election provided that for you. And then finally for the Greens, there was good news for the Greens. In Macclesfield Central in Cheshire East, they won a seat from Labour. The Greens won 41.8% of the vote, up by 19.7%, and Labour's vote almost halved to just over a quarter of the vote. And so the Greens have got their first representation on Cheshire East Council. So really, if you want to be cheered, if you want to be depressed, you just have to pick where you're looking politically, and you will find a result that does that for you. A couple of thoughts, Richard, before I bring you in, Avaki, to get your thoughts on what's happening with this volatility. The big thing for me that I take away from this is that the ground game of our political parties is hugely important at the moment. We've really seen our parties hollowed out in recent decades. Membership has been on a downward trend. It's gone up recently for the Greens. Under Corbyn, it was very significant, of course, for Labour. But the general trend over decades for political parties and membership has been a downward trend. But if parties can motivate people to join them, to get involved in campaigning, to form part of the grassroots, to deliver leaflets, to knock on doors, then the potential for those parties to do disproportionately well in a volatile political climate, I think, is very significant. So certainly if I was in charge of campaigning for any of these parties, that would be a huge focus for me at the moment, getting professional campaign staff dotted around the country, organising grassroots efforts to try and, yes, do well in these local government by-elections, but ultimately they very rarely change the political weather, but in particular for May's local elections, which will be hugely important. And the final thought I wanted to offer on this is that why will May's local elections be so important? Partly because people expect Reform and the Greens to do very well, and for that to be a challenge both to the Conservative and to the Labour Party, respectively. But also because we're at a time, I think, right now, where the assessment of all of the political leaders is how electorally viable are they? What is their electoral appeal? That's not always the case. There are times when parties look to leaders to see whether or not they can be unifying figures for parties that are otherwise quite divided. There are times when parties look to leaders to see whether or not they've got governing competence. I don't think either of those things matter as much now, even in the Labour Party, where they're in government, and there are big questions about governing competence. I don't think either of those credentials matter as much at the moment as whether or not they are an electoral asset for their party who can lead them to success at the next general election. And for that, they really have to be making sure that they're, yes, doing well in these small local contests, but in particular doing well or holding their own or not suffering as much as opinion polls and forecasts expect in next May's local elections.
Yes, a couple of points on that. So I think the first is just reflecting on the point you made about the ground game, about campaign organization and the hard work of campaigning. You know, you and I have both been active campaigners now for maybe 20 years. And I first started phone canvassing in 2005, so it's been 20 years for me now. And for most of my life, I canvassed, pretty much all year round when I lived in constituencies that had a kind of culture of constant campaigning. So particularly when I lived in Cambridge and Oxford and Lancaster, there were very organized Labour parties that did a lot of round the year canvassing. And one of the things for me that I used to like about that is it used to give me a good read of where the mood was. Particularly, I think that one of the benefits of canvassing from the perspective of a canvasser is talking about politics to people who don't normally talk about politics. It's one thing to talk about politics to your friends or even family who are interested in politics, but to knock on a random person's door and ask them about politics and speak to someone who quite often never really speaks to anyone else about politics is actually I find canvassing is almost more of an education for me than I'm sure it is for the electorate. But I think there's something that's changed about canvassing in the last 10, 15 years for supporters of the historic big parties, the Labour Party in my case and the Conservative Party in your case, or I'd be interested to know if this is what your feeling is. When I first started canvassing for the Labour Party, we were told not to bother having in-depth conversations with people on the doorstep. The idea was to find people who were already committed Labour supporters, to identify those Labour supporters, so that on polling day, you would go back and you'd make sure they turned out to vote. And so canvassing was a voter mobilization exercise of your existing supporters, not a voter persuasion exercise. Now, since we've moved to Oxfordshire, unfortunately, there aren't, for me, many opportunities to do Labour canvassing in the town that we live in. There's sadly, the Labour Party is almost moribund. There's a small group of us, but it's not very active. And it was one of the worst performing votes for Labour in the general election. I think the Labour candidate in Witney constituency, well, certainly got in the single figures, just about held the deposit, just got above 5%. So I'm a little bit out of the loop. I've not done as much canvassing in the last couple of years as I normally do. But that is my sense, that it's changed to a persuasion exercise. The second thing I'd say about the nature of campaigning now is that for the local candidates that you've been talking about here, in many instances, their victories are in spite of their party label, not because of it. And the people who do well in these elections, at least anecdotally, and I'm talking to one of them right now, Councillor Lee Evans, who won a county council seat earlier this year as a Conservative, is that the role of the campaign now for those candidates is to establish credibility, bonds of trust, and I'm not speaking about you particularly here, but a certain independence of brand from the party. Not to say that you go out and criticize the party, but that you cultivate an almost a-party political image in front of the electorate. And this all leads me to wonder whether or not in the next few years we might see the rise of more independence, both independent candidates at the local level, but also maybe even at the parliamentary level. Obviously, we saw some independent candidates get elected in constituencies that had significant Muslim voters who were voting for independent candidates who'd been, as I understand it, sort of organized through community and religious networks in those constituencies. I think that's a bit different, actually, than what I'm talking about here, where you actually have, in a low trust environment about politicians, what we would call in political science, political entrepreneurs, independent candidates who stand and say, actually, I'm just going to be a community-focused, non-party political, local person. Elect me to be MP. And part of the reason I think this is the case is that so many MPs who already have a party label are trying to do just that. And they're kind of mimicking what I think we are seeing at the local level as well.
Thought about political entrepreneurs. I quite like that term. It's interesting. I think there is an opportunity there. And I think the disadvantage that they would be at compared to what they would have been at historically versus the established parties is much reduced. So historically, if you are within one of the mainstream parties that's been going for a long time, the party will have historic data on voting intentions in the area you're standing, and that is of some use. The use that is now to candidates is significantly less than it would have been 15, 20 years ago, certainly than it would have been 50, 60 years ago, because of that volatility, because people are changing their votes between elections so much more than they once did. So if you start from scratch, sure, you've got less information about the electorate than somebody within an established party would have. But I don't think that necessarily puts you at a major disadvantage. In fact, old established parties could be using old data that actually harms their understanding of the electorate compared to what you would have as a total newbie. In terms of is it worth having in-depth conversations, I absolutely think it is, not least because of this volatility point, but certainly if you're in the context of local elections, the turnout tends to be quite low. Now, turnout of 35, 40% would be typical, actually quite good in lots of parts of the country for a local election. And so realistically, those are, to some degree, the same people who are turning out election after election after election. A typical example of who that might be could be Mrs. Miggins, who lives down the street, who may be as retired in her 70s, has always voted in elections. It's actually probably quite a consistent voter in terms of who she votes for, but not necessarily fixed. But is somebody who sees voting as part of her civic duty and therefore does it all the time. Trying to persuade that person that you're a good person to vote for is really important. More important, realistically, if we're just being pragmatic about it, than persuading people who hardly ever vote and don't even vote in general elections, because they are just much harder to get to the polls. So I do think those persuasive conversations are really valuable. A third thing I wanted to just touch on is this point about personal brand versus party reputation. Clearly, the dynamic between the two is in great flux at the moment. If I take my own example here without sort of giving away all of the ways in which I try and campaign and will in the future try and win my own seat. One of the things I need to do, obviously, is make people think, irrespective of who they voted for in the past, that I'm a decent councillor for them and that I am worth having as their councillor. I've got stuff done and I'm worth re-electing when the election next comes around. That is not a partisan point in and of itself. That's actually quite a personal point about what my own record is. In some ways, of course, that is linked to being a Conservative because I sit as a Conservative councillor, I vote with Conservative colleagues, and I generally take a more conservative critique to the existing Liberal Democrat administration. But it is largely a personal thing. And in part, when you're in a situation now where there are established parties and challenger parties, part of what incumbents have to do is to try and persuade voters who are weighing up whether or not to stick with a established party or to go to the challenger party. It's true for the Conservatives being challenged by Reform, also true, of course, for Labour being challenged by the Greens or others. What you sort of have to do is to say, well, you are a person worth voting for. And so even though I would probably rather vote for the insurgent challengers, I will stick with you. I'll stick with one of the traditional parties because I think you're a person who's worth backing, or because I think you've got a better chance of winning. And it's that old sort of squeeze argument of tactical voting. Vote Conservative here because actually Reform can't win in Oxfordshire, which is arguably borne out by the local election results we had this year. Just as Reform will make in other parts of the country the argument, vote Reform here because the Conservatives can't win here. So the tactical vote is with them. All the other parties will be making different variations of that. But to wrap this theme up, the key to being able to make those arguments, in my view, is being able to communicate that message effectively in a highly localized way. And although we've had lots of discussions in recent years about the importance of social media and online campaigning and so on, fundamentally, I still think those highly localized messages can be best delivered with people knocking on doors and people putting leaflets through letterboxes in that particular community.
I think in general that makes a great deal of sense for local politics. And although I think there are party political decisions that should be made, I do think there is a role for party politics in local government because ultimately there are big strategic questions that councils have to make. And I think it's worth the public being aware of what the party is planning to do in advance of a local election. There should be a local manifesto. But also, I think parties are a way of holding a collective group to an account for the decisions that they make. So I think that's true. But there is an element of local politics which is much more kind of apolitical as well, and that sort of service dimension of it and casework dimension of it is really important, and that's where that kind of hard work can really come in handy. I think it's a bad thing for national politics, but I think it's the direction that we've gone in, and I think it's the direction we'll go in even more, because I think it's a bad thing that MPs spend so much of their time being caseworkers and social workers and kind of local community champions when actually the job of an MP is to focus on the big issues facing the nation, to hold the government to account or to support the government and to think about the nation as a whole rather than the parochial dimensions. Of course, MPs should be rooted in place. I mean, I think that's one of the good things about our first past the post electoral system is that they are ultimately tied to a particular place. So I'm not completely dismissing it. I don't want people to mistake me and say, make it sound like I'm saying that it's MPs should do no quick casework, should do no work in their constituency. But I think we've got the balance wrong. And I think we're going to get the balance even more wrong as we move into the next general election, as MPs try to establish these independent community worker brands at the expense of the broader party. But actually, party matters for democratic politics and for political accountability. And by running for Parliament, by running against their own party, that actually will make it harder for Parliament to work properly in the future.
I think that's right. I mean, it's an electoral imperative to be seen to be doing things locally in your constituency if you're an MP. But I do think the reality is that most MPs would do better service to their country by making sure we had more effective, better scrutinised legislation coming through Parliament than they would by reporting potholes in their local area. But I think they've all come to the same conclusion about which of those two things makes it more likely they'll be sitting in the next Parliament as well as this one. I did say this was a budget-free zone, but just before we go, I wanted to read a brief extract from Harold Macmillan's diary for the 17th of April 1956, which is an important day in history for students of Harold Macmillan, as it's the day that he delivered a budget, and it's the only budget that he ever delivered. Here's what he wrote in his diary for that day. Budget day. I stayed in bed most of the morning. The nervous strain of these speeches seems to get worse as one gets older. Anyway, I have never attempted anything of the kind before. At 3:27, I went and stood behind the Speaker's chair. At 3:30 exactly, I entered the chamber. The Conservatives gave me a very good cheer. Some of the Socialists tried to barrack a bit. They sniggered at any literary turn of phrase or quotation and behaved like rather ill-bred schoolboys. This was, of course, confined to a few, mostly intellectuals. The old trade union types are much too polite to indulge in this kind of thing. However, I went on and soon got them under control. The speech lasted just under 2 hours. Our people seemed satisfied. I think that's a rather different day than what Rachel Reeves will have in delivering her budget. Certainly, I don't think she'll stay in bed all morning. That's all for this week's Midweek Matters of Interest. We'll be back on Sunday with a look at the 1981 Conservative budget, really one of the most dramatic and arguably consequential budgets in post-war British politics. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.